Still remember the exact feeling of opening my first real paycheck in the early 1970s. Not because the number was big, but because it meant something. It meant groceries for the week, gas for the car, a little cash left for Friday night, and somehow, peace of mind. Before we go any further, let me invite you to slow down with me for a moment. If you enjoy these quiet journeys back in time, stories told the way memories actually feel, take a second right now to subscribe to the channel. These stories are disappearing, and once they're gone, they don't come back. Now, when people today ask me what it really cost to live in America back then, I can tell they're expecting numbers, dollars and cents, rent prices, gas prices. But the true cost of living in the 1970s wasn't just measured in money, it was measured in time, security, dignity, and breathing room. Back then, a man or a woman could work a regular job, nothing fancy, and still feel like life was possible. I wasn't rich, none of my neighbors were, but we didn't feel poor either. We lived in modest homes, drove used cars, fixed things instead of replacing them, and somehow the math worked. Today, when I hear young folks talk about rent eating up half their income, or healthcare bills wiping out their savings overnight, it honestly feels like a different country. In the 1970s, my rent didn't chase me like a shadow. It stayed put. Wages weren't spectacular, but they were honest, and they rose slowly enough that you could plan your life around them. We didn't constantly feel like we were falling behind. There was an unspoken understanding that if you showed up, worked hard, and kept your word, you'd be okay. That belief alone was worth more than any raise. I remember filling my gas tank without checking my bank balance first. I remember grocery shopping without doing mental gymnastics at every aisle. Meat wasn't a luxury. Fresh bread wasn't a guilty splurge. And no one needed an app to tell them how to survive until payday. But here's the part people rarely talk about. We paid a different kind of price. Life was slower, yes, but it demanded patience. There was no instant gratification, no one-click solutions. You waited for things, you saved for things, and when you finally got them, they mattered. Today, everything is faster, shinier, more advanced, and yet somehow heavier, more expensive in ways that don't show up on receipts. As I sit here now, decades later, watching the world race by on glowing screens, I can't help but wonder when living became so complicated, when surviving started to feel harder than building a life. This isn't just a story about the 1970s. It's a quiet comparison between two Americas, one where life felt affordable in spirit, and another where the price of simply existing feels impossibly high. And as we go deeper into these memories, you might start to feel it too, that gentle ache of recognizing something we lost without realizing its value at the time. In the 1970s, when I thought about money, it didn't sit in my chest like a knot. It was more like a tool, something you respected, something you managed, but not something that haunted you every waking hour. I worked a steady job, 40 hours a week, sometimes a little overtime if things were tight. And with that paycheck, I could cover rent, utilities, groceries, and still have a bit left over. Not a fortune, just enough to remind me that life wasn't closing in. Rent especially felt reasonable in a way that's hard to explain to someone today. It wasn't cheap, but it wasn't predatory. Landlords didn't treat tenants like walking wallets. There was a sense of balance, almost an understanding that people needed somewhere to live before they needed to turn a profit. You paid your rent, you stayed put, and your home slowly became part of your identity. Today, I hear about people moving every year because rent jumps overnight, and I can't help but shake my head. Back then, stability wasn't a luxury, it was normal. Groceries were another thing entirely. When I walked into a supermarket in the 1970s, I didn't feel rushed or overwhelmed. The aisles weren't packed with endless choices screaming for attention. You bought what you needed, and most of it was made not far from where you lived. Prices made sense. A cart full of food didn't require sacrifice elsewhere. You didn't have to choose between eating well and paying the electric bill. Meals were simple, but they were real. Meatloaf, stews, fresh vegetables, homemade bread. We cooked at home because it was practical, not because dining out was some unattainable luxury. And gas, well, even with the energy crisis looming in the background, filling up the car didn't feel like a personal failure. Gasoline was part of life, not a weekly anxiety. You drove where you needed to go without calculating every mile. The car itself was a tool, not a status symbol, and certainly not a financial trap stretching over 7 or 8 years of payments. Most people I knew bought used cars, paid them off, and drove them until they couldn't be driven anymore. And here's something that feels almost unreal today. Debt didn't define us. Credit cards existed, sure, but they weren't lifelines. They were conveniences, used sparingly. You didn't build a life on borrowed money. If you couldn't afford something, you waited. And waiting didn't feel like punishment. It felt like responsibility. The true cost of living back then wasn't low because everything was cheap. It was low because expectations were human-sized. Life wasn't designed to extract every dollar from you. It left room for breathing, for saving, for dreaming. And now, when I look around, it seems like the system itself has changed its appetite. It doesn't just want your money anymore. It wants your time, your attention, your peace of mind. And that, more than inflation or numbers on a chart, is what makes today feel so impossibly expensive. One thing people rarely understand about the 1970s is how wages and effort felt connected in a very real, almost tangible way. When you worked, you could see the result of your labor in your everyday life. A raise, even a small one, actually changed things. It meant better groceries, a newer used car, or maybe finally fixing something in the house you'd been putting off. There was a sense that your time mattered. I wasn't climbing some endless ladder just to stay in the same place. I was moving forward slowly, but visibly. Most jobs didn't come with fancy titles or glamorous perks, but they came with something far more valuable: predictability. You knew your hours, you knew your paycheck, and you knew that showing up consistently counted for something. Employers expected loyalty, but they offered stability in return. It wasn't perfect, but it felt fair enough to build a life around. Today, when I hear about people working multiple jobs and still barely scraping by, I can't help but feel a quiet sadness. In the 1970s, one income could often support a small family, not in luxury, but with dignity. A modest home, a reliable car, food on the table, and maybe a family vacation once a year if you planned carefully. That wasn't considered extraordinary, it was considered normal. Healthcare is another place where the difference feels almost shocking. Back then, getting sick didn't carry the same financial terror it does now. You went to the doctor, you paid a reasonable bill, and life went on. There was no maze of paperwork, no fear that one illness could undo decades of hard work. Medical costs were part of life, not a looming threat. And education, well, that might be the clearest example of how the true cost of living has changed. In the 1970s, college wasn't cheap, but it was achievable. You could work part-time, save a little, maybe get some help from your parents, and graduate without carrying a lifetime of debt. Education felt like an investment in your future, not a financial gamble that could haunt you forever. I remember young people talking about what they wanted to become, not how they would survive the loans. Even retirement felt closer, more solid. Pensions were common. You worked, you contributed, and there was a promise waiting at the end. You didn't constantly worry about outliving your savings because there was a shared responsibility between worker and employer. Now everything seems to rest on the individual, as if life itself has become a solo endurance test. The cost of living today isn't just higher, it's heavier. It places the burden entirely on your shoulders. In the 1970s, there was still a sense that society was built to support the effort of ordinary people, Not perfectly, not equally for everyone, but enough to keep hope alive. And when hope is affordable, life feels possible. That's the part that feels truly impossible to recreate today. Not the prices, but the belief that tomorrow would be a little better if you just kept going. Housing, more than anything else, tells the real story of what it cost to live in America during the 1970s. I remember the first place I truly called my own, not because it was impressive, but because it was reachable. Owning a home wasn't a fantasy reserved for the lucky or the wealthy. It was a goal you could touch if you were patient and responsible. Mortgages didn't feel like life sentences. Interest rates rose and fell, yes, but the idea was simple. You paid, slowly built equity, and one day the house was yours. That promise alone gave people a sense of grounding that's hard to put into words. Neighborhoods felt stable because people stayed. Kids grew up together, neighbors aged side by side. You knew who lived next door, and chances were they'd still be there next year. That stability lowered the emotional cost of living in ways no spreadsheet can measure. Today, housing feels like a moving target. Prices climb faster than wages, and ownership drifts further away with every passing year. Back then, houses weren't treated like speculative assets. They were shelters, places to raise families, plant gardens, and fix squeaky doors on Saturday mornings. Most homes were modest in size. You didn't need extra rooms to justify your worth. You lived within your means because your means were respected. Utilities were another quiet blessing. Electricity, water, heating, these were reliable and relatively affordable. You didn't live in fear of opening the monthly bill. Conservation was about common sense, not survival. You turned off lights, you didn't waste water, but you didn't sit in the dark to save money. Even phone service was straightforward. One line, one bill, one purpose. No bundles, no endless fees, no confusing contracts. The simplicity itself kept costs down. And then there was the cost of raising children. In the 1970s, kids didn't require a constant stream of purchases to be considered cared for. They wore hand-me-downs, played outside, and entertained themselves with imagination instead of expensive devices. Childhood wasn't monetized the way it is now. You didn't feel pressured to provide endless enrichment programs just to keep up. School supplies were simple. Birthdays were modest. Love wasn't measured by how much you spent. I look at parents today, stretched thin by daycare costs that rival rent, and it honestly feels cruel. Back then, one parent often stayed home, not because it was easy, but because it was possible. Families structured their lives around time together, not just financial survival. The true cost of living in the 1970s included sacrifice, yes, but it didn't demand exhaustion as a constant state. Life had room for pauses, for evenings on the porch, for conversations after dinner. Now, it seems like every aspect of living has been optimized for profit, squeezing out the quiet moments that once made the cost feel worth paying. Transportation in the 1970s tells another part of this story, one that feels almost forgotten now. A car back then was freedom, not a financial trap. Most people didn't buy brand new vehicles unless they truly needed to. Used cars were plentiful, affordable, and built to be repaired rather than replaced. You could pop the hood, recognize what you were looking at, and maybe even fix it yourself or with the help of a friend. Repair shops were everywhere, and the cost of keeping a car on the road didn't feel like a second rent payment. Monthly car payments, if you had them at all, were manageable and short-lived. You paid it off, and then the car was yours. Simple as that. Today, when I hear about 7-year loans and software-locked features, it feels like transportation has quietly turned into a subscription. Insurance was another thing that didn't dominate your thoughts. You had coverage, you paid your bill, and you trusted that it would be there when you needed it. It wasn't a maze of exclusions and fine print. Driving itself felt different. Roads were less crowded, and the pace of life seemed to match the speed of the traffic. You weren't constantly rushing from one obligation to the next. Commuting didn't consume hours of your day, draining your energy before life even began. Public transportation, where available, was affordable and straightforward. No apps, no surge pricing, no uncertainty. You planned your day, and the system met you halfway. Leisure travel, too, carried a different weight. Taking a road trip wasn't an indulgence. It was part of American life. You packed sandwiches, filled a cooler with soda, and drove for hours just to see something new. Motels were simple and reasonably priced. Vacations didn't require months of debt or careful financial gymnastics. You traveled within your means, and that was enough. Even airfare, while not as common, felt more human. Flights weren't packed to the edge of discomfort, and you didn't feel nickel and dimed at every step. The experience respected the traveler, not just the transaction. When I compare that to today, where every movement seems monetized, it's hard not to feel a sense of loss. Transportation costs now don't just move you physically, they drain you mentally. The constant calculations, the fear of breakdowns, the endless payments. In the 1970s, getting from place to place didn't feel like a battle against your bank account. It was simply part of living. And that's the pattern I keep noticing as I look back. Life was built around use, not extraction. Things served people, not the other way around. The true cost of living stayed reasonable because the system hadn't yet learned how to squeeze every mile, every minute, and every necessity for maximum profit. Entertainment in the 1970s is another place where the true cost of living reveals itself, not in what we paid, but in how little money it took to feel fulfilled. Fun didn't require a subscription, an upgrade, or the latest device. Most of it was woven naturally into daily life. On a typical evening, the television came on after dinner, and that was enough. A handful of channels, familiar voices, shows everyone talked about the next day. You didn't pay extra to escape ads, and you didn't feel overwhelmed by endless choices. Television felt communal, almost comforting, because we were all watching the same thing at the same time. Going to the movies was an event, but it didn't break the bank. Tickets were affordable, popcorn was simple, and you didn't leave the theater feeling like you'd been overcharged at every turn. Music, too, had a different relationship with money. You bought a record, took it home, and it belonged to you. You listened to it until the grooves wore down, and every scratch became part of the memory. There were no monthly fees to keep enjoying what you loved. Radio played a huge role, and it was free. DJs felt like companions, guiding you through your day. Entertainment didn't chase you, it waited for you. And then there was the kind of joy that cost almost nothing at all, sitting on the front porch as the sun went down. Kids playing ball in the street until the streetlights came on. Card games at the kitchen table, community events, local fairs, church gatherings, high school sports. These things didn't exist to generate profit. They existed to bring people together. Leisure wasn't something you purchased. It was something you participated in. Compare that to today, where entertainment is endless, but somehow exhausting. Every moment of downtime seems designed to pull money or attention from you. Subscriptions pile up. Devices demand upgrades. Even relaxation feels scheduled and optimized. In the 1970s, boredom wasn't feared. It was a doorway to creativity. When there was nothing to do, you found something to do. And that lowered the emotional cost of living in ways that are hard to quantify. You didn't need to earn more just to enjoy yourself. Fun scaled naturally to your life. The true cost of living stayed manageable because joy wasn't locked behind a paywall. Looking back, it's clear that we didn't have more. We needed less. And in needing less, we somehow felt richer. One of the quiet advantages of living in the 1970s was how time itself felt less expensive. That may sound strange, but it's true. Days weren't chopped into notifications, reminders, and endless obligations. When you left work, work usually stayed there. You weren't reachable every second, and no one expected you to be. That separation alone lowered the psychological cost of living in a way we didn't fully appreciate at the time. Evenings belonged to families, to rest, to simple routines that grounded you. The pace of life allowed you to recover, to feel human again before the next day began. Shopping, for example, didn't consume your mental energy. You went to the store, bought what you needed, and came home. There were no algorithms trying to predict your desires, no constant pressure to compare prices across dozens of platforms. Choice existed, but it didn't overwhelm. That simplicity saved time, and time back then felt like something you actually owned. Work itself carried fewer hidden costs. You dressed for the job, you showed up, and you did what was asked. There wasn't the same expectation of constant self-promotion or personal branding. You didn't need to reinvent yourself every few years just to stay relevant. Skills aged more gracefully, experience mattered. That stability reduced anxiety and allowed people to plan their lives with a sense of continuity. Today, everything feels provisional, like it could vanish with the next update or economic shift. Social life, too, didn't come with a price tag. Friendships form naturally through proximity, neighbors, co-workers, classmates. You didn't need expensive outings to maintain relationships. A cup of coffee, a backyard barbecue, a walk around the block was enough. People showed up physically, not just digitally, and that presence carried a kind of wealth money can't replace. In the 1970s, loneliness existed, but it wasn't amplified by constant comparison. You didn't see everyone else's curated happiness on a screen. You lived your life without measuring it against thousands of others. That alone kept expectations grounded and costs reasonable. I think about that now, watching younger generations juggle endless commitments, side hustles, and digital noise, and I wonder how anyone is supposed to rest. The true cost of living today isn't just financial. It's the constant demand on your attention and energy. In the 1970s, life asked less of you outside of work, and in return, it gave you back something precious: mental space. And when your mind isn't constantly under siege, even modest means can feel like enough. Food in the 1970s deserves its own quiet reflection because it shaped daily life in ways that went far beyond the grocery bill. Meals weren't rushed. They weren't eaten in cars or in front of glowing screens. Dinner was a pause in the day, a moment when time slowed enough for people to reconnect. Most food was prepared at home, not because it was trendy or virtuous, but because it was practical and affordable. Cooking wasn't framed as a chore you escaped from. It was simply part of living. Ingredients were straightforward. You didn't need a long list of specialty items to make a satisfying meal. A roast could feed a family for days. Leftovers were expected, not avoided. Food stretched further because life itself stretched further. Eating out existed, but it was occasional, something you looked forward to rather than relied on. Restaurants didn't need to be cheap because they weren't everyday crutches. And when you did go, the experience felt special without being excessive. Portion sizes were reasonable. Prices didn't leave you with regret. Today, food feels expensive not just in dollars, but in effort and guilt. You pay more, worry more, and enjoy it less. In the 1970s, there was trust in the food system that feels fragile now. Labels were simpler. Processing was less extreme. You weren't constantly navigating conflicting advice about what was safe or healthy. That trust lowered the mental cost of feeding a family. Even school lunches were reliable, not gourmet, but nourishing enough to get kids through the day. Hunger existed, of course, but it wasn't hidden behind abundance. There was less waste because food still held value. You didn't throw things away lightly. That respect kept costs down naturally. Community played a role here too. Potlucks, shared meals, neighbors exchanging dishes. Food brought people together without requiring spending. Today, eating often feels solitary, transactional, and rushed. In the 1970s, it was social and grounding, and that social grounding mattered because it reminded people that living wasn't just about earning and spending. It was about sharing and sustaining. When I compare that to now, where food delivery apps turn every craving into a financial decision, I see how the true cost of living has crept upward quietly, not because people eat better, but because eating has been separated from living. Back then, nourishment, both physical and emotional, was woven into daily routines, and when life feeds you in more than one way, the cost feels lighter, even if the numbers aren't dramatically lower. Healthcare, even with all its imperfections, felt fundamentally different in the 1970s, and that difference changed how people lived. Getting sick was never pleasant, but it wasn't accompanied by the same fear that it could ruin your life financially. You went to the doctor, you were treated, and you received a bill that, while not insignificant, was understandable. Insurance, if you had it, did what it was supposed to do. There weren't endless phone calls, surprise charges, or the feeling that you needed a law degree just to understand your coverage. Doctors knew their patients. Appointments weren't rushed to the minute. Care felt personal, not industrial. That alone reduced stress, and stress has a cost we rarely acknowledge. Mental health too existed in a quieter way. People struggled, certainly, but life didn't constantly push them to the edge. Community, routine, and slower living acted as buffers. You weren't bombarded with bad news every hour of the day. You didn't compare your life to thousands of others before breakfast. That doesn't mean the 1970s were easier for everyone, but the pressure was different. It came in waves, not as a constant flood. Healthcare costs today aren't just higher, they're unpredictable. And unpredictability is expensive. In the 1970s, you could plan, you could save. You didn't live with the sense that one accident could erase everything you'd worked for. That sense of security, even if imperfect, allowed people to take risks, to start families, to build something slowly. And then there's the cost of aging. Growing older in the 1970s felt more supported. There was an expectation that society would care for its elders, that work would lead to rest, not endless worry. Social security felt reliable, pensions provided structure. Retirement wasn't about maximizing returns, it was about dignity. You didn't need to become a financial expert just to grow old without fear. Today, aging feels like another problem to solve alone. The true cost of living now includes the constant fear of falling through the cracks. In the 1970s, those cracks felt narrower. When I look back, I realize how much of our peace came from shared systems that worked well enough. Not perfectly, but predictably. And predictability is a kind of wealth. It allows people to live instead of constantly preparing for disaster. That, more than any medical bill comparison, explains why living back then felt possible in a way that feels increasingly rare today. Education in the 1970s carried a sense of promise without the shadow of lifelong burden. Learning felt like a door opening, not a chain locking behind you. Public schools weren't perfect, but they were trusted. Teachers were respected, classrooms were simpler, and expectations were clear. You learned the basics well enough to navigate the world, and for many people, that was enough to build a stable life. Higher education, if you chose it, was approached with seriousness, not desperation. College was something you planned for, saved toward, and often worked through. You could hold a part-time job, pay tuition, and still have time to live. Graduating didn't mean starting adulthood in a hole you'd spend decades trying to climb out of. Student loans existed, but they didn't define a generation. Education was seen as a tool, not a product sold at maximum profit. Trade schools and apprenticeships were respected paths, not second choices. Learning a skill meant you could support yourself. That connection between education and livelihood kept costs grounded and expectations realistic. Today, education feels like a high-stakes gamble. The price rises faster than the value, and young people are asked to commit before they fully understand the consequences. In the 1970s, guidance came from experience, not marketing. Parents, teachers, and neighbors shared what they knew, and that collective wisdom mattered. Another thing that lowered the cost of living back then was the absence of constant credential inflation. You didn't need endless certifications to prove your worth. A high school diploma, a solid work ethic, and reliability could carry you far. Skills mattered more than titles. That allowed people to enter adulthood without delay, start families earlier, and build stability over time. When I look at today's world, where learning never seems to end but security never arrives, I see how education has shifted from empowerment to pressure. The true cost of living now includes years spent chasing qualifications just to stay afloat. In the 1970s, education fit into life instead of consuming it, and that balance made living feel achievable, not overwhelming. Community in the 1970s acted like an invisible safety net, one you didn't notice until you really needed it. People didn't talk much about community back then because it was simply there. You knew your neighbors' names. You borrowed tools instead of buying new ones. If someone fell on hard times, word traveled quietly and help showed up without forms or announcements. That kind of support lowered the true cost of living in ways no government program ever could. You weren't entirely on your own. Even small towns and city neighborhoods shared this feeling of familiarity. Local businesses knew their customers. Shop owners extended credit informally. Trust wasn't naive. It was practical. It kept money circulating locally and relationships strong. Today, so much of life is mediated through corporations and systems that don't know you and don't need to. In the 1970s, life felt more personal. That personal connection reduced friction and expense. Childcare is a good example. Neighbors watched each other's kids. Family lived closer. Children moved freely within a shared space where many eyes were watching. You didn't need expensive services just to get through the day. That kind of trust saved money, but more importantly, it saved stress. Social rituals also played a role. Church, civic clubs, school events, union meetings. These weren't just hobbies, they were anchors. They gave people identity beyond their jobs and routines. Belonging didn't require spending. You showed up, you participated, and that was enough. When life throws difficulties your way, belonging acts as a cushion. In the 1970s, that cushion existed for many people in ways that feel rare now. Today, isolation adds to the cost of living. When you're alone, every problem becomes more expensive. You have to solve everything yourself or pay someone to do it. Back then, help often arrived before you even asked. That didn't eliminate hardship, but it softened it. Looking back, I realize how much of our financial resilience came from social ties. We weren't richer in money, but we were richer in connection. And connection, when it's strong, makes life feel manageable even when times are tough. That's a form of wealth that's hard to recreate once it's gone. Inflation in the 1970s is something people love to bring up, and for good reason. Prices did rise, sometimes sharply, and there was real anxiety about the economy. I remember the headlines, the conversations at the dinner table, the concern about the future. But here's the part that gets lost in modern comparisons. Even when inflation hit, life didn't collapse under its weight. Wages, while not perfectly aligned, moved enough that people could adjust. The ground under your feet still felt solid. You tightened your belt, delayed a purchase, maybe took on a little overtime, and you got through it. Inflation was a chapter, not a permanent condition. There was a shared understanding that hard times would pass. That belief mattered more than numbers. Today, inflation feels different. It lingers. It touches everything at once: housing, food, healthcare, education, and wages struggle to keep up. In the 1970s, inflation raised prices, but it didn't fundamentally redesign life to extract more from you. You still had options. You could downsize, repair, substitute. Systems weren't optimized to prevent escape. Another difference was expectations. People didn't expect constant growth or endless upgrades. A refrigerator lasted decades. Clothes were worn until they truly wore out. That resilience made inflation survivable. In today's world, where so much is built to be replaced, rising prices hit harder. The true cost of living increases not just because things cost more, but because they're designed to fail sooner. Energy costs are another example. Even during fuel shortages, people adapted. They drove less, carpooled, planned better. It wasn't convenient, but it was possible. There was a sense of collective adjustment. Today, rising energy costs feel individualized and punitive. You're expected to absorb them quietly. In the 1970s, economic pain was acknowledged publicly. Leaders spoke to it, communities discussed it. That shared experience reduced fear. When everyone knows what's happening, the burden feels lighter. Looking back, I realized that inflation didn't break the spirit of the 1970s because the systems around people still allowed dignity. Life wasn't cheap, but it was negotiable. And when life is negotiable, people can adapt without losing themselves. That flexibility is what feels impossible today. Technology, or rather the lack of it, played a quiet but powerful role in keeping the cost of living manageable in the 1970s. Life wasn't automated, optimized, or constantly upgraded. And because of that, it didn't demand constant spending just to keep up. You bought something once, learned how to use it, and relied on it for years. Appliances were mechanical, understandable, and repairable. When something broke, you fixed it. When you couldn't, you found someone nearby who could. There were no forced updates, no compatibility issues, no subscriptions attached to basic functions. Ownership actually meant ownership. That alone kept long-term costs low. Communication was simpler too. One phone in the house, one bill, and that was it. Long-distance calls were special, not daily habits. You planned conversations instead of scattering them throughout the day. That limitation created intention, and intention reduces waste. Today, we pay continuously just to stay connected, and the stream never ends. Technology now promises convenience, but it quietly raises the cost of living by making itself indispensable. In the 1970s, you could opt out without falling behind. There was no fear of missing an update that might affect your livelihood. Work didn't require constant connectivity. Skills didn't expire overnight. That stability allowed people to invest in their lives with confidence. Even entertainment technology followed this pattern. You bought a television, a radio, a record player, and that was enough. You didn't need to replace them every few years. New models existed, but they weren't mandatory. Today, obsolescence is built into everything. Devices age quickly by design, and replacing them has become a recurring expense rather than an occasional one. The true cost of living rises not just from higher prices, but from repetition, paying again and again for what you once owned. In the 1970s, progress moved slower, and that slowness protected people from financial whiplash. Life didn't demand constant adaptation. You adapted when necessary, not continuously. Looking back, I see how that stability allowed people to focus on living rather than managing systems. Today, so much energy goes into maintenance, accounts, passwords, updates, contracts, that living itself feels like a secondary task. And that constant background effort is expensive in ways we're only beginning to understand. When I think about work in the 1970s, what stands out most isn't the paycheck itself, but the relationship people had with their jobs. Work was something you did, not something you constantly worried about losing overnight. Jobs felt rooted. You knew where you stood. Many people stayed with the same employer for years, sometimes decades, and that continuity shaped the cost of living in subtle but powerful ways. When your income is stable, everything else becomes more affordable emotionally. You can plan, save, and commit without fear that the ground will vanish beneath you. In the 1970s, layoffs happened, of course, but they weren't a constant threat hovering in the background. Work hours were clearer. When the shift ended, the day was done. You didn't carry your job home in your pocket. That separation reduced burnout and allowed people to recover, which in turn made life feel sustainable. Benefits mattered too. Health insurance, paid time off, pensions. These weren't rare perks reserved for the lucky few. They were part of the agreement between worker and employer. That shared responsibility lowered the true cost of living because it spread risk across institutions instead of placing it entirely on individuals. Today, work feels fragmented. Short-term contracts, gig labor, constant performance tracking. Income arrives unpredictably, and unpredictability is expensive. In the 1970s, dignity was tied to contribution, not constant hustle. You didn't need to prove your worth every day through metrics and numbers. Showing up and doing your job well was enough. That respect had value. It reduced stress-related illness, improved family life, and gave people energy for things beyond survival. Even unions, controversial as they were, played a role in keeping life affordable. They negotiated not just wages, but stability. That stability created a middle ground where ordinary people could live without fear. Today, flexibility is praised, but it often comes at the cost of security. In the 1970s, security was the foundation that made modest wages workable. Without it, even higher pay struggles to cover the emotional cost of living. Looking back, I realize how much of our financial resilience came from knowing tomorrow looked similar to today. That sameness wasn't boring, it was comforting. And comfort, when it's shared, keeps life from feeling impossibly expensive. As I look back on the 1970s from where I sit now, what strikes me most is how expectations shaped the true cost of living. We didn't expect life to be perfect, fast, or endlessly improving. We expected it to be steady. That expectation alone made it easier to live within our means. Success wasn't measured by how much you displayed, but by how well you managed what you had. Keeping a roof over your head, food on the table, and a little time for yourself was considered a good life. There wasn't constant pressure to upgrade, to outgrow your surroundings, or to chase a version of happiness sold by someone else. Advertising existed, but it didn't follow you everywhere. You weren't reminded every minute of what you lacked. That silence lowered the emotional cost of living. Today, comparison is constant and merciless. Expectations rise faster than incomes, and dissatisfaction fills the gap. In the 1970s, patience was a virtue because time still felt like it belonged to you. You saved for things, you waited, and waiting didn't feel like failure. It felt normal. That patience protected people from debt and from the quiet panic that comes with living beyond your means. Even ambition had boundaries. You wanted to do better, yes, but you didn't expect life to transform overnight. Progress came slowly, and that slowness made it sustainable. I think about young people today, racing against costs that never stop climbing, and I realize how heavy modern expectations are. You're asked to build a life faster, with less support, and under constant scrutiny. The true cost of living now includes exhaustion, anxiety, and the feeling that you're always behind. In the 1970s, life wasn't easier in every way, but it was kinder to the human nervous system, and kindness matters. When systems are built with human limits in mind, people can endure setbacks without breaking. That resilience made modest incomes feel sufficient. Looking back, I see that what made living possible wasn't just lower prices. It was a culture that accepted enough as enough, and that acceptance, once lost, is incredibly expensive to replace. As these memories settle, I realize that the true cost of living in the United States during the 1970s can't be captured by charts, inflation calculators, or nostalgic headlines. It lived in the spaces between numbers. It lived in the confidence that tomorrow wouldn't suddenly become unrecognizable. We didn't have more money, but we had more certainty. And certainty is a form of wealth that rarely gets counted. Life back then asked you to participate, not to constantly adapt. You learned routines, built relationships, and moved forward at a pace that matched human limits. When problems arose, they felt solvable because the systems around you weren't actively working against you. Today, it often feels like living itself has become a negotiation with forces you can't see or control. Every necessity is layered with complexity, fees, and uncertainty. That's why the past feels impossible to recreate. Not because people were better or harder working, but because life was structured differently. The economy left room for ordinary lives. And when ordinary lives are supported, extraordinary things quietly happen. Families form, communities strengthen, people age with dignity. None of that required wealth. It required balance. As someone who lived through that time, I don't tell these stories to argue that everything was better. It wasn't. There were struggles, injustices, and fears we carried too. But the basic act of living didn't feel like a high-wire act without a net. The true cost of living stayed within reach because society accepted that people needed room to breathe. That acceptance has slowly eroded, and until it returns, no amount of innovation or convenience will make life feel affordable again. If this story stirred something in you, if it reminded you of a time when life felt steadier or showed you a version of America you never experienced, I hope you'll stay with this channel. These memories matter. They carry lessons we're still trying to relearn, and as long as we keep telling them, they're not lost. As the story comes to a close, I want to leave you with one simple thought. If you lived through those years, your memories matter more than ever. And if you didn't, understanding them might help make sense of why the present feels so heavy. If this reflection resonated with you, take a quiet moment to subscribe to the channel and stay with us. These aren't just stories about the past, they're reminders of what made life feel livable. Share this video with someone who remembers or someone who needs to hear that another way of living once existed. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment about what life cost back then for you, not just in dollars, but in effort, time, and peace of mind. I'll see you in the next memory.